I'm going to read some verses to kind of prepare our minds. A lot of people think that music prepares your heart to receive the Word, but it's actually the Word that prepares our hearts to worship in music. So I want to start by reading a few verses out of Colossians. Talking about Jesus, Paul writes, "He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For everything was created by Him, in heaven and on earth, the visible and the invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through Him and for Him." So with that, Barry's going to lead us in some singing.
Woo-hoo. The first song is "I'll Fly Away," and it's page 4. Page 6. I think that's right. You're right.
Waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in
page 22. It's Wonderful, Merciful Savior.
I said all even numbers.
Make my day happy.
Three songs.
It is a 2 and a 2.
Yeah, that's what we're-
Two.
Expanding to.
Wonderful, merciful Savior, precious Redeemer and friend, who would have thought that a lamb could rescue the souls of men? Oh, you rescue the souls of men. Counselor, Comforter, Keeper, Spirit we long to embrace. You offer hope when our hearts have hopelessly lost the way. Oh, we hopelessly lost the way. You are the one that we praise. You are the one we adore. You give the healing and grace. Our hearts always hunger for. Oh, our hearts always hunger for. Almighty infinite Father, faithfully loving your own. Here in our weakness you find us, falling before your throne. Oh, we're falling before your throne. You are the one that we praise. You are the one we adore. You give the healing and grace. Our hearts always hunger for. Oh, our hearts always hunger for.
Beautiful, Bear. Good job. Let's have a word of prayer for the kids who meet. Father, we thank you so much for this privilege and opportunity to gather together and study your word together. Lord, open our hearts and our minds to receive the truth that you'd have for us. We just ask that you'd take special care to be with those who weren't able to make it here tonight, and whatever they have going on. We just ask for you to take special care of them and give them what they need. And Lord, we just again praise you for this building and the graciousness of the fire department to let us use it. And we ask that we would use it to your glory tonight. In Jesus' name, amen. So last week we took a look at this account of Paul and Barnabas in Lystra and how they were mistaken for gods. And I made the argument that I think Paul messed up here. I really pushed the reality that we need to contextualize the message while not changing the message in order to connect to those we share it with, and how Paul had went into this kind of backwoods town and didn't really understand the people he was talking to. And so when he preached and then performed a miracle, they thought that he was Hermes and that Barnabas was Zeus, and they were going to do these sacrifices to them. But more importantly, I belabored the point that Jesus must be the focus. And that anything that happens and anything that we do that takes the attention away from Jesus needs to be eliminated, needs to be removed. And what we saw here was that because of Paul's inability to connect with them and then this miracle, I don't think Paul did it intentionally, but the focus was taken off of Jesus and on to Paul and Barnabas because of this miracle. So Today, I want us to look at their response after they realized that the message wasn't connecting and that a miracle had intended, that they'd intended for good. I mean, a guy was healed, was in fact actually working against their message. And so we're gonna kind of look at that. So, if we will, we're going to pick up in verse 11. We're going to read down through here again, just kind of refresh our memory. When the crowd saw that what Paul had done, they shouted, saying in the Lycaonian language, "The gods have come down to us in human form." Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. The priest of Zeus, whose temple was just outside the town, brought bulls and wreaths to the gates, because he intended with the crowds to offer sacrifice. The apostles Barnabas and Paul tore their robes when they heard this and rushed into the crowd, shouting, "People, why are you doing these things? We are people also, just like you, and we are proclaiming good news to you, that you turn from these worthless things to a living, or to the living God, who made the heaven, the earth, the sea, and everything in them. In past generations, he allowed all the nations to go their own way, although he did not leave himself without a witness. Since he did what is good by giving you rain from heaven and fruitful seasons and filling you with food and your hearts with joy, even though they said these things, they barely stopped the crowds from sacrificing to them." Some Jews came from Antioch and Iconium, and they won over the crowds. They stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, thinking he was dead. After the disciples gathered around him, he got up and went into town. The next day, he left with Barnabas for Derbe. And so we see that Paul was preaching. He saw that lame man. He healed him. The people took this miracle to mean that Paul and Barnabas were these Greek gods that have come down in human form. And it wasn't immediately clear to Paul and Barnabas what was going on, because there was this language barrier. But as soon as they realized it, what had happened is the priest of Zeus had come to prepare the offering and sacrifice to them. And that kind of tipped them off. And so I think you need to understand a little bit about sacrifices. You know, sacrifices to gods or spirits are not uncommon across all religious practices. From the very first sin in the Bible, we see the death result. If you go back and you look at Genesis chapter 3, verse 21 specifically, the first death ever referenced in the Bible is when it says, "The Lord made clothing from skins for the man and his wife, and he clothed them." So while it's not explicitly stated, it's generally understood that an animal had to die to cover their nakedness, to cover their shame. And this was long before Noah, the Tower of Babel, the calling of Abraham, and the establishment of Israel. And so that idea was there from the beginning. And over time, as people got further away from the line that God was using eventually to Abraham, they adapted and they changed it and they morphed it into something that is different. So it's very common. So the practice of sacrificing to a god over time became sacrificing to little g gods. And a common lie that is actually pretty fun to research and expose is that all religions are fundamentally the same. Because when you start researching and looking in, this lie seems plausible because there's many things like this that you can find that are shared practices. If you think about it, worldwide, there's a few things that a lot of people like to point to say that, well, you know, you just have your version of it. How about the fact that there's a common flood in the history of a lot of different places? The worldwide flood. So there's a common flood story. There's this idea of wrestling with morality issues. We call it sin. But there's this idea of being on your good behavior and doing what's good for other people. And there's also this interaction between their gods or other worldly spirits and the human world, that they interact with each other. And if you start to explore all that, it seems plausible at first, but then you dive in and you realize that really they're just perversions of what the truth is. And so you have people that will sacrifice. I was in a country one time where they were sacrificing a pig because a girl in town was sick, and they thought that they had angered some spirit, and so they had to sacrifice this pig for this girl to get better. That's what it had morphed into. And so when these people come to them, with this sacrifice, they are thinking that they're trying to earn that. So the reality of death and what happens after death is an underlying question that people search for all the time. What does this life mean? And so in their mind, and in the minds of a lot of people in the world, they think that what they have to do is make God happy. And if I can do things not to offend God, I don't want to make Him mad, but if I can make Him happy, then I'll be in His good graces. And then good things will go along in my life. And that's been a key misunderstanding of sacrifices in general. Instead of seeing it like the book of Hebrews actually explains it as a shadow of things to come, it was just meant to point to Jesus. People started to think of it as a bribe to get in the good graces of a disgruntled God. Even the Jews had fallen for this false application a little bit, and I'm not going to dive into it, but go read Hebrews. You'll see where they messed up. But in Hebrews it says that was a shadow of things to come. It was all pointing to Jesus. But these people had come to sacrifice to Paul and Barnabas. Paul and Barnabas obviously at this point know that something's up. And they're like, wait a minute, this is not right. And they have three reactions. The first reaction you see there in verse 14. The apostles, Barnabas and Paul, tore their robes when they heard this and rushed into the crowd. They displayed distress and despair. The physical display of ripping their robes was evidence of this. This was showing the people of the crowd that what they were doing was not well taken. Have you ever been to a big business meeting and the chairman or whoever's running the meeting has to say, somebody says, I have a point of order, and he says, point not well taken. It always seems so formal to me, but Paul and Barnabas here are displaying that this is not well taken. They're having this emotional reaction to what's being displayed before them. Now, they're not acting out of anger or disgust. They're distraught. They're upset. They're sad that this happened. They're like, these people think we're gods. We've messed up. That's not what the message that we had. And so it upsets them. And I think this is important for us to remember, because when we see those who are stuck in sin, those who are being affected by sin, those whose sin will ultimately lead to hell, what is our reaction? Do they know that we care? Now, we may never agree about that particular sin, but they should know that their decision makes us sad. If they choose to keep their sin and deny Christ, I'm not happy with that. I mean, I respect their right to make that decision. If God respects it, I respect it, but I'm not happy about it. I'm sad about it. And I'm not what you would call an emotional person. Typically when I have emotions, I tend to beat them up and shove them back inside where they belong. But people ought to know that how you feel about that. But I do think it's honest for us to have a healthy display of the motivation behind sharing the gospel. That we see somebody who is a slave to sin, we have the cure in Jesus, and they choose not to. My granddad, on my mom's side, James, he was a stubborn man. Well, actually, all my grandfathers were stubborn, and my mom and my dad are both stubborn, and I come by it honestly. But my granddad specifically comes to mind when I talk about this, because he was diagnosed with cancer, I want to say almost 10 years before he died. And it was one of those cancers that could have been easily treated and taken care of, but he just said no. And I look, and I understand, and he has the right to do that, and I've talked to a lot of people who said they would have said the same thing in the same situation, but in those last couple of years of life, I watched him suffer because the cancer had spread and was causing major problems. And so I was saddened by that fact, that there was a cure for this. They could fix this one. And he chose not to. So that's kind of the idea, that Paul and Barnabas displayed this despair, this distraughtness over the misunderstanding, the communication that had broken down. But then they also verbalize that confusion. They identify it. They say, if you look at verse 15, what they're shouting is, people, why are you doing these things? We are people also, just like you. we're proclaiming good news to you, that you turn from these worthless things to the living God. And so what they're saying here is in opposition to their desire to sacrifice. They're clarifying that they're just men. Paul had done a miracle, and so their assumption was that they were gods. But he's clarifying, we're just men, we're not gods. And that they say that their intent was to bring them good news. And so they express that their recognition of what's going on is a mix-up. So this aspect of the story is really connected with me because I'm always on a quest to express my thoughts better. I'm sure most of you at one time or another have been misunderstood. I mean, you get it. So when you think about it, I'm surprised, we're not misunderstood more. Have you ever thought about communication? There's a thought in my head that I have to use whatever physical capabilities I have in my lungs and vocal cords and mouth and tongue and teeth and lips to create sounds that we've just agreed on create words. And I put those together to try and transmit an idea that you're going to hear and it goes into your brain to decode. The fact that we get anything across to one another surprises me sometimes. And there's a lot of aspects that go into that. And written words don't convey nearly as much information as spoken words. If you can talk to somebody face to face, it's much better than just... Because there's so much that's there. There's a lot that can be cultural, but communication is just hard. And so this misunderstanding, Paul and Barnabas needed to verbalize. They needed to say, no, this is a correction. They needed to clarify what's going on. What's most important here is that they recognized the misunderstanding and they addressed it. We can't be afraid to seek clarity and to correct misunderstandings. This isn't the same as disagreeing. One of the most impactful books that I ever read was How to Read a Book. Have you ever read that? It's called How to Read a Book. The authors make a point in there that you are not allowed to disagree with a book until you clearly understand the author's point. And what they mean by that is, if me and Barry are having a disagreement, I need to make sure that I clearly understand his side so that I know that I'm disagreeing with the right thing. Because we might actually be on the same page, we're just not talking the same language. In the world of debating, this could be understood kind of like a straw man that you create. But they're arguing against the wrong thing. And so what they suggest that you do is to think through the terms and think in a way that if you were to explain this back to the author, would they say, yes, that's what I'm saying? If it's not, then you need to ask more clarifying questions and try to understand what they're trying to say. Then once you understand what their argument is or what they're saying, then you can have a point of disagreement. Before you can disagree, or before that point there, you're disagreeing with a misunderstanding on your part. And so I'll get mad at a book, and that's actually not what the book said at all. I'm like, oh, sorry, I'm arguing with the wrong thing. In simple terms, Paul makes clear by verbalizing the fact that these people think that he and Barnabas are gods, and that the conclusion they had is not the message that Paul intended them to come up with. So he says it very plainly. No, wait, we are people just like you. And the message that I came to tell you about was about a living God. The living God. And so he's fixing that. He's clarifying that. And then the third thing that he does here is that he turns the conversation, he steers the conversation back to Jesus. Look at verse 16. Actually, the end of verse 15. Who made the heaven, the earth, the sea, and everything in them. In past generations he allowed the nations to go their own way, although he did not leave himself without a witness. Since he did what is good by giving you rain from heaven and fruitful seasons and filling you with food and your hearts with joy. If you'll notice, he's tying this back into where he was talking about, we are proclaiming good news to you. We're bringing you good news about a God who is creator and who is benevolent. He wants our good. Remember, the gods on their mind, the way the Greek mythology worked, and most pagan gods around the world, aren't benevolent gods. They're gods that are really mean-spirited, selfish gods, and you're trying your best to bribe them and get in their good graces. But Paul is saying, no, I'm talking about the living God, the one who created everything. And by the way, even if you're not following him, still blesses you by giving you air to breathe and water to drink, and the sun comes up every day for the sinner and the saint. So when he refocuses the crowd, what he does is he backs up and starts at the beginning, creation. There's a lot here in this particular passage. I'm going to save it, most of this, until we get to Acts chapter 17, because I think this interaction right here is actually the basis for Paul's sermon in Acts chapter 17 at Athens. You know, when he goes in and talks to them about the unknown God that they have. This is like the bud for what's going to grow into that. And by the way, Romans chapter 1 as well. And so I'm going to deal with that more in Acts chapter 17. I just want to point out here that Paul does contrast that their gods are not the living God. The God of creation, who is a benevolent God, is not the God of components of creation who uses humanity for selfish reasons. If you go back and you look into any paganism, any of this Greek mythology, Roman mythology, and any of those, actually you can look at Hinduism and several of those now, they have gods of something, creation, an element of creation, and you need to make that God happy for that part of creation to bless you. And so if they had a god of, lightning, or a god of the trees, that was their thinking process. And so Paul is going back to creation to remind them there's something outside of creation that made creation. Creation is the evidence of the Creator. And he does this in Romans chapter 1 so well. He says they are without excuse because God's divine attributes have been seen through creation. And so when he does that, what he's doing is he's reminding, he's kind of guiding them back to the main focus here. At this point, the crowd is convinced that this is not Zeus and this is not Hermes. So they were able to prevent them from making sacrifices to them. And by doing that, if you notice in the text here, it says that they were barely able. Even though they said these things, they barely stopped the crowds from sacrificing to them. So really what you have here is still a very volatile situation. Paul and Barnabas are still on the defense. It's a delicate situation with the majority of the people there in Lystra. There were some believers that had believed and kind of understood what Paul was saying. But when you think about this, Paul comes in and he's preaching about Jesus, who is God with us. He demonstrates a great power in healing a man. These people are like, oh, they're gods. That was confusing. Now Paul and Barnabas are rebuffing, they're rejecting the people's attempt to worship them and to admire them. This is a rough time. And then if you look at verse 19, the unbelieving Jews show up. They show up at the worst time for Paul and Barnabas. They're just having to deal with this crowd and that's there. The crowd's kind of lost their captivation with them. And the unbelieving Jews riled them up. They swooped in and they won over the crowd. Now, we're not told what they did to woo over the crowd. We're not told what they talked about. But my guess is that the Jews did not seek to convert them from pagan Gentiles to Jewish people. I think what they did is they sought to discredit and disparage Paul and Barnabas. They went in and said, look, these guys, I know they've just made a mess here. They've done the same thing in Antioch. They did the same thing in Iconium. They're going around and they're stirring up all this trouble among everybody. And we see that this works. And then we see the result. That Paul is stoned and drug out of town, left for dead. That's a quick change. Just a few verses, they go from people thinking they're gods to stoning him. So Paul is stoned. Now, don't pass over this too quickly. This is a death sentence. The full intention of the mob was to kill Paul. I don't know if you know much about stoning, but it is a very slow, painful, nasty way to die. Basically, people pick up stones that are small enough for them to throw, and they stand around and they help you with stones until you fall down, and then they continue to do it until you're dead. So he was left for dead. That was their intention. They thought he was dead. But he did not die. I find it interesting, though, that Paul was the only one stoned. I think it's because he was the vocal one. That's why they said that they chose Hermes for him, was because he's the one that did the most talking. But Paul was the one that got stoned. But also notice that when they thought Paul was dead, they leave, and it's kind of over for them. Nobody stays behind to make sure that Paul is dead. It says the disciples gather around him, and he gets up and he goes back into town. But when he goes back into town, did they hide him? Did they, wasn't there somebody in town that said, "I thought we just killed you. What are you doing in here? Finish the job." But for them, it was over. They had carried out what they had intended to do. And I think this displays the power of mob mentality. Obviously, since Paul didn't die and he came back to town, somebody could have seen him and they didn't follow through. But when you think about the crowd or a mob, people tend to do things they normally wouldn't do by themselves. They kind of get caught up in the moment. They're controlled by emotion or peer pressure. And then once the satisfaction of that moment is gone, it kind of leaves. Back when I went through crowd control and riot training in law enforcement, they made it very clear that you cannot fight them all. You're simply outnumbered, right? So the tactic that they teach you is to observe the crowd, identify the instigators, and we would go and arrest them. We would, do things to get them, arrest the instigators, the ones that are riling up the crowd. They're provoking the crowd to do things. And when you remove those people, the crowd's emotion calms down and they can be dispersed. What I'm saying here is that, have you thought about being someone in that crowd? Throwing rocks at Paul? Maybe there was somebody in that crowd who threw rocks at Paul that later becomes a follower of Christ. Paul was in that same situation. If you remember, he was part of the crowd that stoned Stephen, and then later he becomes a follower. He was one of those people. It doesn't say that he threw any rocks, but he was there. He was the one that held the coats. And if I have to admit, there were times when I was seeking to justify my sin that I did the same thing and attacked Christianity. Attacked the faith, because if you can tear it down, you can do that. But I think about that. Maybe some of these people later become believers. I think about Paul laying there. He's now in a position to identify with, believe, and say what he heard Stephen say. "Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing." And here's Paul, probably thinking the same thing. Even if Paul didn't say it, reading his letters, I believe it was in his heart. You see, when we think about this crowd that stoned him, we gotta understand that there's many people who are simply caught up in cultural current. It's like getting caught in a rip current out here. They're being pushed or pulled or influenced by things, and they don't even notice it until it may be too late. So these people are being influenced by peer pressure and emotion and sensationalism and sensualism. And they don't even know it. Most of the time, they're not really enemies of Christianity, although there some are that are actively working against Jesus. But most people are not. And so we have to do what Paul did. It should break our hearts and drive us to pray for them. It should motivate us I'm going to go out on a limb here, but I don't think enough Christians are heartbroken looking at the state of lostness around us. A lot of Christians are just mad and they seek retribution. They're like, God, just judge them now because I don't like what they're doing. They'll get what they deserved. Well, I'm glad he waited because there was probably somebody who said something like that about me. Some are pompous and they look down with disgust and say, well, I made better decisions than you. Can't believe you're caught up in that sin. Other Christians are surprised and they fail to do anything. They're just caught off guard. And then others are scared, so they hide from it all and just ignore it. But we have to recognize it for what it is, and it should drive us to pray for them and to motivate us to share the gospel like it did for Paul. We must engage in conversations that clarify the gospel. There's a skill or tactic that I used in martial arts for sparring, where when we were competing, we were in a match. When you're doing that, it's kind of rare to get a point just off of one technique. If you've ever seen any of that stuff, you just do one thing. It's very, very rare to get a point that way. So what you had to do was figure out some combinations or put things together to kind of do that. But what I would do is I would put out some of those single attacks, a kick here, a punch here. I'd do some combinations, but I was setting a level of expectation. And what it did was create a distraction. What I was doing was building up their defense against something that didn't matter. I was teaching them to defend against me by doing this. And then at some point I would just change. And because this would create an opening, and I would just change and do whatever I needed to do. So when I saw their defense starting to lead to that way, then I would change it up and I would do whatever. And again, this goes back to that straw man argument. But a lot of times what tends to happen is we get distracted by arguments that don't really matter. We get distracted by things that don't really help clarify the gospel. And so we'll end up in an argument with somebody over a particular topic, and we may win that topic, but that didn't matter because they didn't hear the gospel. I would do this so well that sometimes I would know that if I was in a room, there's somebody I'd fought before, I know he's probably going to be a next level up. I would actually do 2 or 3 matches and win them with this other type of technique and the way that I defended myself. And then in the last fight when I fought that person, I completely changed. They had no idea because I knew they'd been watching. And here's why I tell you that. A lot of times we're preoccupied with things that don't matter. The enemy has succeeded in getting our attention off of what is most important. The current issue, whatever we're arguing about, is not the core issue. And so we're preoccupied with winning that battle that we're forgetting the war. Or whatever analogy you want to use there. But if you pay attention and take the time to talk to people, talk to individuals, you're going to find out that they have names, they have interests, they have desires. They have ideas. And you can talk to them instead of a crowd. You can clearly present the gospel. You can identify what they're searching for and show them how Jesus has the real power. And I found that most of the time, what a person thinks about me or my beliefs is not accurate. How many times somebody said, oh, you're a Baptist pastor. And they make all these assumptions, but they don't even know me. They've not talked to me to ask what my beliefs may be. And I think we do the same thing about other people. Individually, we can have real conversations where we can clear it up and clarify the gospel. The problem today is that most people have not developed the ability to have a real conversation. Social media, forums, and being able to be behind a computer screen has made real conversation really hard because people will be different. In Montana, one of the ranchers used to say, people talk different to each other when everybody carried a 6-shooter. And I think being that disconnect from people, we can say things without somebody punching you in the face right away. And it's changed the way we communicate. And everything turns into an argument instead of a real conversation. Now, there are a few people who love conflict, but most of us don't. And the world has fed us a lie that any disagreement is a full-blown conflict or fight. And so we can't talk about things and disagree about things in a healthy manner. And that's just simply not true. Most people value honest conversation, and they're willing to engage with somebody who they feel is authentic and fair. And then you can talk clearly about the gospel, always pointing to Jesus. I learned a long time ago that you cannot argue a person into heaven. I don't know of anyone whose opinions and thoughts have changed about Jesus because a Christian outwitted them or found the right gotcha argument. But I do know people who have changed their thinking and have come to Christ because I was willing to have an honest conversation, and in that conversation point to Jesus. It's good and proper to have intellectual defenses for moral issues and being able to have a rational input into to social issues of the day. But at the end of the day, our goal is not to win an argument or to get them to conform to a behavior that I like. It's not even a goal to influence culture for the betterment of humanity. The goal is to faithfully, clearly, and with great love present the gospel of Jesus Christ in word and deed. It's about Jesus. As I mentioned last week, we must not let good things, even good things, become our focus instead of Jesus. We must share the good news found in the story of Jesus, and our actions should demonstrate this good news. That's what you see Paul doing. After he made that initial mistake and they kind of got mixed up, what Paul does is he goes right back into his intention for being there. I'm just a person. Casting Crowns has a song, and it's like, I'm just a beggar telling another beggar where to find food. Clearly articulating the gospel and always pointing them to Jesus. And so with that thought, I'm going to give you 3 questions for consideration, and then we can have a little time of discussion here. So question number 1, have you ever been misunderstood? What created that situation? Okay. Number 2, how are Christians today misunderstood? And how has that obscured our real message of the gospel? And number 3, what questions or what reactions do you find in yourself concerning those people who are far from God? Yeah, we'll read them out again. So the last one was, what reactions do you find in yourself concerning those far from God? So when you see people who are far from God, how does it make you react? And I'll be honest, I have different ones based on what sin they're displaying at the moment. So, not right, but I'm just being honest. So, all right, with those questions, you guys online can join us next week, and we will look forward to joining you again.